Hi there, welcome to Read by the Author. This is season 1.5, the first in-between-y season of the podcast. This season, we are reading Blood Ties by Tarah Benner, and let's continue the story.
Chapter 7. Gabriel. The Backroom Sister Club in Fort Collins was a total bust. I'd gone to check it out the night after Wesley invited me to the club, trying to keep a low profile. Fort Collins technically wasn't my territory, but the trip was uneventful. From there, I decided that my best bet was to track down the new clan that had sprung up in Hilltop. If Letitia was a night supremacist, that made her a likely candidate for both the murders and the clan's sire. I had a feeling that if I found the clan, I'd draw her out of hiding. I rode my motorcycle in case I ran into trouble. I preferred the bike over the Audi. It allowed me to squeeze through tight spaces and disappear easily, but a motorcycle was terrible for moving dead bodies. I'd had at least a half dozen bikes over the years, but my current street bike was a Kawasaki Ninja ZX-10R. It was sleek and fast and extremely lightweight. It allowed me to go pretty much anywhere I wanted. Blazing down the deserted street through the Cherry Creek shopping district, it occurred to me that Hilltop was a strange place to raise a new brood of vampires. The giant Crate and Barrel and the Trader Joe's I passed on the way offered a clue about the type of people who lived in Hilltop. Many of the houses on Tree Streets went for $1 million and up. But, then again, most vampires had accumulated a great deal of wealth by the time they reached Letitia's age. Sires were known to take care of their clans, and investing in pricey real estate wasn't unheard of. The steeply pitched roofs of the red brick Tudors seemed to glare at me from the backs of their well-manicured lots as I zipped up the residential street. This was the type of place where people knew their neighbors and paid a professional landscaper to keep their hedges straight. It was much too respectable for residents not to notice strange people coming and going at all hours of the night. They'd certainly notice if their neighbors started turning up dead. Depending on whom you asked, vampirism could be considered an identity, an affliction, or a lifestyle. Some fed in secret and wiped their victims' memories. Others adopted mortal pets, flunkies with whom they shared some kind of sexual power dynamic. To some, the way a vamp had been turned was everything. Some had been fed on for decades as mortals before they begged their sires to turn them. Others had been turned against their will, killed with vampire blood in their system, and then fed human blood after they reanimated. But no matter how they satiated their thirst, vampires all had one thing in common: the need for human blood. A vampire could survive for a time on the blood of large game, but I'd never known one who drank slowly from animals and lived for more than a year. Animals didn't have high enough concentrations of ether in their blood, and vampires had to drink so much of it to keep themselves going that a steady diet led to what they called blood bloat. It made them weak, slow, and sickly. Those vamps were usually killed by their sire. Parking my bike near the corner, I got off and started walking back toward 4th Avenue. The tall trees cast long shadows through the pools of light from the street lamps. Most houses had their porch lights on, and a small, yappy dog barked as I passed. Through the large picture window in front of one house, I could see a husband and a wife watching the news. Everything appeared to be in order, but looks could be deceiving. Up ahead, I heard the rhythmic slap of footsteps. A lone figure passed under a street lamp. He was dressed in a black t-shirt and wore a pair of earbuds. Just a jogger, I told myself. I didn't sense a vampire, but my right hand itched for the stake in the modified holster under my jacket. I held my breath as the jogger approached, but he cut across the grass and onto the street to give me a wide berth. I let out the breath I'd been holding. Apart from the distinct hum of traffic and the occasional dog barking, the street was quiet. It had me on edge. I reached 4th Avenue and cut over to Delilah Street, where I could see a row of the same type of houses with stuffy arched entryways and long, elegant walks leading up from the street. The wind kicked up, making leaves skip along the curb. Up ahead, I saw the same jogger cross the street perpendicular to where I stood. Something wasn't right. I could feel a slight prickle along the back of my neck and knew I was being followed. Turning slowly on the spot, I saw a petite blonde teenager standing just outside the glow of the streetlight. She had long, stringy hair and pale, chalky skin, and I knew immediately that she was a vamp. It was difficult to tell until you'd seen one up close, but vampires stand much too still. They try to compensate by forcing themselves to breathe, but it's never completely natural. Mortals always move a little or shift their weight from side to side. Vampires are as still as statues right before they attack. I didn't think. I just pulled up the sleeve of my jacket and fired an arrow from my wrist bow. The vamp's hand shot out in a flash of white, snatching the arrow out of midair. Shit, I muttered as she snapped it in two. It was a poor excuse for a real stake, but it could subdue a vampire if you struck one in the heart. I knew the vamp was going to pounce a split second before it happened. She disappeared from where she'd been standing, flying toward me through the darkness. I turned just in time and grabbed her by the arm, slamming her into a parked car. Pinning her with one arm, I freed my stake from its holster. But then the vamp bared her fangs, and I saw the hunger in her eyes. The teenage vamp hadn't fed that night, and my blood was even more tempting than a mortal's. I couldn't let her sink her fangs in. Vampire venom had a sedating effect. Once it got in your bloodstream, you quickly lost the urge to fight. I was so distracted by the gleam of her fangs that I didn't notice the second vampire until he was upon me. One moment, I was fighting to sink the stake into the first vamp's heart. The next, I felt the rough wood cutting into my windpipe as a male vamp tried to choke me from behind. This vamp was pudgy and middle-aged. He could have been the teen vamp's father. I tried to slip the second vamp and failed, giving him the opportunity to tighten his hold. I could feel his cool breath on my face as he brought his fangs close to my neck. The stake was pressing into my windpipe, making it difficult to breathe. Grabbing onto the ends of the stake, I braced my feet on the hood of the car and tried to push it away from my throat. I succeeded in opening my airways enough to breathe, but the vamp was too strong for me to break his hold. I looked around. I sensed more vampires approaching. 2 of them shuffled slowly across their lawn, a normal-looking husband and wife. Another came from a house on the other side of the street. A 4th had stepped out to water the lawn and was now headed straight for me. Had the clan taken over the entire block? Releasing one hand from the stake, I threw my fist over my shoulder and shot another arrow. A howl of pain shattered my eardrum as it skewered the vamp through the eye. It wasn't a kill shot, but it was enough to yank myself free from his grip. Just then, a car turned down the street and slowed to a crawl. It wasn't a car the vampires recognized, probably a mortal who'd taken a wrong turn. The vamps froze, deciding what to do, and I sprinted up the walkway of the adjacent house. Vaulting the fence, I ran for my motorcycle, which was parked on the next street over. I was sure the vampires weren't far behind, but they were concerned about drawing attention. A motion-detecting light came on as I tore through someone's backyard. I heard a low, booming bark, but I managed to catch the dog by surprise. I heard its claws scrape along the deck, and my shadow stretched cartoonishly as I ran. Jaws snapped at my heels as I flung my body over the fence and landed on the other side. Thankfully, this yard had neither a dog nor a fence. It was a straight shot to the corner where I'd parked my bike. I could see it gleaming under a streetlight. Jamming on my helmet, I threw a leg over the bike and started the engine. I peeled out in a wide circle just as a pair of bright headlights whipped around the corner. I caught a glimpse of bloodthirsty eyes as I flew past a black Mercedes. I whipped around the corner as fast as I could, heading for the highway so I could lose them faster. A screech of tires in the distance told me the vamps had followed, but the howl of wind in my ears drowned out everything else as I merged onto I-25. The other cars became colorful streaks as my speedometer crept past 90. Broken white lines faded to a blur, but then I saw familiar headlights behind me. Shit. The lights appeared and then disappeared as the vampires stared down my tailpipe. Then I was blinded by another flash of lights and heard the roar of another car behind me. This one was a Porsche. The vehicles flanked me on either side, and I glanced over in time to see the vampire who tried to strangle me. My arrow was still lodged in his eyeball, and I turned back toward the road to decide how to lose them. Traffic was thinner at this time of night, but there was still a steady stream of cars. Up ahead, I could see a bottleneck of traffic. Surely the vamps would try something before we reached it, or risk me flying down the center line. I was about to miss Colorado Boulevard, my last chance to exit the highway. Holding my breath, I let off the throttle and watched as the car zoomed ahead. My tires were warm, but it was still a tight turn as I veered across 2 lanes of traffic. I grinned. I could almost hear their howls of frustration. Young vamps may have superhuman speed and strength, but they are much easier to fool. I took Colorado Boulevard and banked east on Highway 30, wondering if it was safe to head home. I made a wide loop and my stomach dropped. The Porsche was coming right at me. "Damn it," I growled. How had they caught up? It must have taken some risky maneuvering. Groaning, I pulled the bike around and hit the throttle as hard as I could. I was in Kane's territory now, but I only cared about losing them. Jetting through the parking lot of an indoor storage place, I wasn't prepared for their Mercedes. It came flying around the corner at breakneck speed. I tried to stop, but I didn't have time. It collided with my front tire, and I went flying over the handlebars. I'd wrecked my bike plenty of times before, but I was never ready for it. Flying through the air after the initial ejection would have been fun, if not for the plummeting feeling of terror and the anticipation of pain. The entire left side of my body burned as I skidded across the blacktop. My head hit the ground with an agonizing smack, my helmet bouncing off the pavement. For a second, I just lay there, breath completely knocked out of me. There's always that moment of naked terror when you worry you won't be able to move. But my body hurt too much for me to be paralyzed. My legs still worked, I was relieved to note. Staggering to my feet, I pulled off my helmet. 3 vamps had gotten out of the Mercedes. My bike lay on its side between us, and I could hear the hum of the Porsche nearby. A second later, it squealed up beside me, and I knew there was no way out. All right, I thought. Come on, motherfuckers. If I was going to die, I planned on taking a few vamps down with me. Behind me lay a pile of wood pallets. I stomped on one to break off a board and then kicked until the plank split in 2. I broke the stake in half over my knee, and the blonde vampire took a step forward. Just then, I heard a high-pitched whine that sounded like a motorcycle, but it was much too close to be coming from the road. It sounded as though it was right on top of us. The beam from a single headlight streamed over the pavement as a black and white Honda CBR tore through the parking lot. The rider drove straight at the cluster of vampires, who scattered like rats in a kitchen. The biker made a tight turn and pulled around to face me as a third motorcyclist peeled into the parking lot. The first rider jumped off and tossed down his helmet. I let out a groan. It was Kane. "You shouldn't be here, Pierce." "This clan's mine," I called. "They followed me from Hilltop." In truth, I had no business hunting them, since I couldn't link the clan to the murders, but he didn't need to know that. Kane was a tall beefcake of a man with huge biceps and a little pinhead. He had a repeating crossbow slung over his shoulder, and he fired off 3 arrows into the knot of vampires, dropping the dad vamp with the arrow in his eye. The 2 vamps nearest Kane lunged for his crossbow, and another pair attacked the mystery rider. As the final vamp encroached on me, I realized that they'd given Kane and me a convenient excuse to take out their entire clan. My vampire lunged, knocking me to the ground. Every inch of me already hurt. It bared its fangs like the colonel when provoked, and I rolled it off me and lunged. I drove the stake through its heart in one hard shove, eliciting an ear-splitting shriek. The cry swelled as the vamp's body ossified, finally dying out in the cool night air. The sound of breaking glass drew my attention. One of the vamps had tossed the mystery rider through the lobby window of the storage facility. Scrambling to my feet, I sprinted over and tried to stake the vamp from behind. It whipped around in a flash of fangs, knocking me to the ground. I hit the pavement harder that time, and my destroyed body throbbed in protest. If it hadn't been for the adrenaline, I might have blacked out. Every inch of me ached with deep tissue bruises. Hauling myself upright, I shot an arrow at the vampire's back. It arched in pain, stopping short of the rider, and wheeled around with a hiss. Casting around for my dropped stake, I felt something whoosh past my ear and the cool sting as it grazed it. The vamp staggered back and crashed into the desk, a full-sized arrow lodged in its heart. "You kill any vamps with that toy bow of yours?" Kane boomed. "Sometimes," I called, reaching up to touch my bloody ear. Recovering from my momentary shock, I looked down at the mystery rider. She was splayed in a pool of sparkling glass, clearly still stunned from the impact. I knew it was a she from the tight leather she was wearing and the shape of her body underneath. She was slim and had an athletic build. Her helmet had fallen back off her face, revealing a beauty mark just over her lip. "Morgan?" I choked in stunned disbelief. But I didn't have time to get a response. Kane's second vampire burst through the window, knocking me against the wall. I caught it with a right hook to the jaw, and it staggered back on its heels. I lunged for my stake, but the vamp's boot flew out, catching me under the chin. I hit the ground, and the vamp dove on top of me as I reached for my weapon. I shoved the stake up with all my strength as it opened its mouth. I heard a loud crack as I broke through bone, but I knew I'd missed its heart. The vampire dipped its head, and I felt a hard pinch. A pleasant warmth spread out from my neck, but I could feel its fangs inside me. I groaned in protest, but I didn't scream. My face and throat felt tingly. I could feel the venom spreading through my body, dulling my pain from the inside out. What had started out as a slight tingling warmth soon enveloped me in bliss. Any urge to fight quickly drained out of me. I could barely move my eyelids. Soon I was floating in a cocoon of comfort. I no longer cared that it was going to kill me. This wasn't so bad, I thought to myself. There were certainly worse ways to go. At least I wasn't in any pain, and my vision was a trippy swirl of color. I might have succumbed and let it take me if it weren't for the scratch of stubble. The sensation of a man's beard on my neck pulled me out of my daze. As awareness returned to my mind and body, I tried to struggle against him. But the venom had worked its way through my bloodstream, and I couldn't move a muscle. Terror raced through me as I lay there on the floor. The vamp was going to suck me dry. I would be awake, but unable to move. Then I saw a dark blur rising. Something heavy collided with the vamp, eliciting a sting of pain. I heard a crunch of wood rip flesh and bone, and the vamp's weight dropped onto my chest. Morgan was standing over the vamp's prone body, shaking her head at my stupidity. I couldn't feel anything except irritation, even though the vamp was crushing my ribs. A few thoughts stuck with me as I drifted in and out. First, that Morgan was a dirty little minx, pumping me for information so she could poach my vamps. Second, that I was damn lucky she and Kane had shown up, and I would never live that down. Chapter 8. Wesley. Wesley always got the jitters when he went undercover, and that night was no exception. The difference was he was getting ready to crash a BDSM party, and he wasn't at all sure how easy it would be. He cruised the mostly empty third floor of the parking garage to make sure they were alone. Then he pulled his truck up alongside Ruby's bright red Camry. When he rolled down his window, she was freshening her makeup, applying black lipstick and messing with her hair. She'd styled it in heavily gelled curls that clung to her scalp for a slicked-on effect. When she'd finished, she popped the mirror back up and got out, hiking up her pleather pants as she stood. The look was completed by a leather vest and boots, but she pulled a black raincoat on over her outfit for a more discreet walk to the club. "Wow, you sure look the part," said Wesley as she climbed into his truck. He was impressed and a little more nervous. He'd been assured that these play parties didn't involve actual sex, but they sounded pretty edgy. Ruby glanced in his direction, snapping a spiked leather cuff onto her wrist. "And you could not look more like a cop." Wesley opened his mouth but closed it again. Costumes had never been his forte. He was wearing a t-shirt, dark jeans, and a black leather jacket that he hadn't worn in years. He also had on a pair of black leather boots, but these just looked like ordinary footwear, not the tall spiked stilettos that Ruby had on. She shook her head and rummaged in her enormous bag, which was also made of black leather. "Put this on," she said, brandishing a long leather strap with silver rings attached to more straps. It jingled as she moved it, and Wesley wasn't immediately sure how he was supposed to wear it. "What is that?" he asked. "It's a harness," said Ruby. Her voice was brisk and matter-of-fact. She wasn't embarrassed at all. "It goes around your chest." "You've been to one of these before. There's a lot you don't know about me." "Clearly," said Wesley, his mouth lifting into a smirk. Ruby gave him a stern look. Wesley cleared his throat, slightly worried, and then shrugged out of his jacket. He threaded an arm through one strap of the harness, but Ruby stopped him with a hiss. "You've got to take your shirt off," she said impatiently. "Nobody's going to tell us anything if they make us before we even walk through that door." Wesley didn't respond, but he did pull his shirt over his head and slip obediently into the harness. The metal rings were cold against his bare skin, but the leather straps weren't so bad. They fit around his upper chest and shoulders about as comfortably as a gun holster. His actual gun was concealed in the roomy sheath of his boot. He couldn't wear it on his belt and risk someone at the party noticing it. He didn't ask where Ruby had her weapon. Glancing down at her tight leather pants, it was no place he wanted to know about. "Jacket on over that," Ruby muttered, once the harness was snugly in place. Wesley did as he was told, and Ruby cracked a satisfied grin. "There, that looks pretty good." Wesley snorted. He wasn't sure anyone was going to buy this getup, but he decided to defer to Ruby's expertise. Once she was convinced that he wasn't going to blow their cover, she slipped out of the truck and set out ahead of him. They decided to arrive at the party separately. For one thing, discussing who would play the dominant and who would play the submissive was not a conversation Wesley wanted to have with his new female partner. For another, arriving as apparent strangers would give them the freedom to move around the party separately. Even though Lucian had given both their names to the dungeon master, whoever that was, Wesley still wasn't sure how easy it was going to be to walk their way into this party. He knew from experience that infiltrating a niche community, particularly one as tight-knit and secretive as the Denver BDSM scene, wasn't something one could rush. When he'd worked Vice, it had taken him 18 months to get close enough to collar the leader of a dangerous narcotics ring. But if they were dealing with a spree killer, they needed to catch her before she cooled off and disappeared from their radar. The night was pleasantly crisp and breezy as Wesley made his way to the club. He was glad he'd worn the heavy leather jacket. He would have been dressed just right for the weather if he hadn't been forced to go shirtless underneath. When he reached the entrance to the club, he was relieved to see that he hadn't been entirely off base with his choice of clothes. The man working the door was your typical beefy bouncer, dressed in a tight leather shirt. He was wearing leather chaps over his jeans, but other than that, he looked pretty normal. "Name?" he asked. "Wesley Smith." "All right, Mr. Smith. I assume you've been briefed on the rules for the evening? No touching others without their permission, no smoking, no drugs, no guns, no taking photos or video once inside. I'll need to confiscate your cell phone. No nudity, except in the blue room. That's first come, first served. Keep it safe and consensual. Don't interrupt anyone else's scene. What happens in the dungeon stays in the dungeon. Do you agree to these terms?" "Yes," Wesley stammered, handing over his phone. It was password protected, but it still made him uneasy. "The cover is $40. That includes 2 drink tickets. Additional tickets may be purchased from the dungeon master." Wesley reached for his wallet and forked over the cash, and the bouncer jerked his thumb behind him as a way of gesturing him inside. "Have fun." Fun wasn't the word that came to mind as Wesley stepped inside the club. He was sweating under his jacket, which made the leather harness stick to him uncomfortably. Familiar pop music was blaring over the speakers as he walked down the narrow hallway leading to the main floor. The back room looked pretty much the same, apart from the leather-clad patrons roaming the dance floor and lounging in the booths. As Wesley cast around for Ruby, a pale man in a leather hood and short shorts walked in front of him, led on a leash by a pixie-like woman in leather lingerie who blew a kiss at another girl as she passed. At the table nearest him, a muscular man in a leather vest had been blindfolded, and an attractive woman with a riding crop was marching a slow circle around him. The man was quivering slightly, but whether he was nervous or just excited, Wesley couldn't tell. There were other scenes unfolding up on the balcony, but there was nothing except the occasional crack of a whip and a whimper to indicate what was happening. It wasn't really Wesley's thing, but he felt his body relax with the realization that it wasn't nearly as bad as he'd imagined. Everyone in his line of sight seemed to be having fun. They were laughing and joking and bringing around drinks. Mostly, he was struck by how normal they all seemed, apart from the leather and the props. Finally, he spotted Ruby up on the balcony, leaning against the rail. She had her back to the crowd below, but he could tell that she had a good vantage point from which to observe the party. Her head turned in his direction as he passed below, but she didn't make eye contact or give any indication that they knew one another. Since she had the entrance and the balcony covered, Wesley found a seat at the bar beside two leather-clad patrons. He ordered a drink from a bartender he recognized, the redhead who'd waited on him the other night. Apparently, they were serving from a limited menu. The drinks were all sweet-sounding concoctions named after sex acts, and Wesley chose the only one that didn't contain any Baileys or Kahlua. He handed over one drink ticket and took a cautious sip, puckering his lips at the strong taste of triple sec. "Good turnout tonight," he said to the man sitting on his left. He was dressed in a leather vest and a collar, but looked friendly enough. "Are the parties always this packed?" The man turned his head in Wesley's direction but didn't respond. The man sitting on his other side stood up, shooting Wesley a dirty look. He conferred briefly with the man in the collar, and the two of them walked off. Was it something he'd said? "You're new," came a voice to his right. It wasn't a question. Wesley turned to look at the woman who'd had her back to him before. She had pale porcelain skin and long strawberry blonde hair that fell over her back in a smooth rippling curtain. She turned her chin to look over her shoulder, and he caught the flick of a lipstick smirk. "Is it that obvious?" he asked. The woman's smile broadened, and she swiveled around on her bar stool to face him. Under a silky black trench coat, she was dressed in a leather leotard, fishnets, and tall, spiky boots. Wesley's eyes lingered too long on the milky skin beneath her leotard, but he froze when he confronted her penetrating gaze and blood-red lips. The lipstick should have looked garish on someone of her complexion, but it didn't. If anything, it made her pale skin seem almost luminous. "It's considered impolite in our circle to speak to a submissive without the permission of his or her dom," she explained, nodding at the man who'd left. "That's what the collar means?" Wesley asked, feeling very obtuse. The woman nodded. "Thank you for explaining that," said Wesley graciously. "And you're right. I am new here." "I figured," she said, licking her lips. "I've never seen you before, and I know just about everyone." "You go to a lot of these things?" "I run them," she said at once, holding out an elegant hand. "Madame Letitia, Dungeon Master." She brushed the silver pin on her lapel with her free hand. The text was engraved on a shield like a coat of arms, and she rolled her eyes a bit. Wesley took her hand and shook it. Her grip was light, but he could feel the strong solidity of her bones underneath. Her skin was cool to the touch. "Wesley." "Wesley," she repeated, narrowing her eyes in pleasure as if she liked the sound of his name. "And what brings you to our little soiree?" "Oh, just curious, I guess." Madame Letitia nodded, as if she heard this a lot. "And what about our circle made you curious exactly?" Wesley thought for a moment, racking his brain for something convincing. "It just seemed sexy." "You'd like to try being dominated by a beautiful woman." As she spoke, she held his gaze, and Wesley found himself agreeing. There was something about those dark eyes. They weren't just beautiful, they were hypnotic. Staring at Madame Letitia, Wesley felt as though she were holding him captive with nothing but her mysterious allure. Her eyes flickered to the balcony, where Wesley was still aware of Ruby watching the party below. "But there is another woman who looks as though she'd like to make you her plaything." "I don't think so," Wesley chuckled, feeling a strange sense of giddy relief as Madame Letitia released her gaze. "I know a dom's brand when I see one. You've had that woman's attention ever since you walked in. It's almost as if you know each other." Wesley swallowed. Either he and Ruby hadn't been as discreet as he'd thought, or the madam had a sixth sense. His brain groped for some scrap of information from the articles he'd skimmed about BDSM. "I think it's best to leave the outside world out there," he said, stumbling a bit over his words. The suggestion that he knew Ruby from somewhere else seemed to appease Madame Letitia, if for no other reason than it had a ring of truth. "I know why you're really here," she said after a moment, nodding at the pretty red-headed bartender. "You've been here every night looking for someone, I hear." Wesley's breath hitched. So much for bartender's reputation for discretion. "Since you're new here," Letitia continued, "let me give you some advice." She swiveled her body around to face his, crossing one leg over another and holding him captive with her gaze once again. "Don't go playing with fire, detective. You're liable to get burned." Alarm bells were going off in Wesley's head, but the warnings were somewhat muted by the power of Letitia's eyes. He tore his gaze from her, about to stand up, but Letitia put one delicate hand on his thigh. "Don't fret, darling. Your secret's safe with me." He glanced back up at her face, clearing his throat as he prepared to excuse himself. But as soon as her eyes latched onto his, Wesley seemed to forget why he'd come to the party in the first place. This wasn't his scene, but he didn't hate it. Most everyone he'd encountered seemed nice. But as he stood there, the other party-goers seemed to fade into the background. All he could see was Letitia's pale, angelic face, framed by a curtain of spun copper and gold. Her pale lashes were painted black, intensifying her deep, dark eyes. Every muscle in his body tensed as she got to her feet, that hand still pressed firmly into his thigh. His heart was pounding, but he couldn't move. It was as if he was glued to his seat. She took one step forward and positioned her hips directly between Wesley's legs. She lifted her hand from his thigh and trailed it up his hip bone and along his ribs, bringing it to rest just below his clavicle. She traced a line straight across the bone, lingering for a moment at the base of his throat. His chest was rising and falling rapidly, but Letitia stood as still as a statue, watching the rapid flutter of his pulse. He wasn't even sure that she was still breathing. She leaned in to whisper something in his ear, and Wesley was engulfed by her sweet floral scent. "You didn't come here for work," she whispered softly, those red lips brushing the tender flesh at his neck. "You came here to play. With me, I think." Wesley's throat had gone very dry, but he managed a hoarse grunt of assent. That wasn't it, was it? He had this feeling that wasn't why he'd come to the party, but he was powerless to disagree. Letitia pulled back, and he was hit once again by the full force of her gaze. Suddenly, it made perfect sense. "Wait for me here," she said, stepping back so quickly that Wesley's breath left him. "I'll show you the ropes, so to speak."
Thanks for listening to the Read by the Author podcast. To find out what happens next in the story, stay tuned for the next episode. Until next time, happy reading!